Welcome to Retail Radio, brought to you by Retail Strategies, where we support community development and retail growth. Now, in this episode, we're exploring a rediscovered interest in the third place. These are those essential spaces in our communities that are neither home nor work, but places where we gather, socialize, and build connections. We'll discuss its importance, the impact on community engagement, and the role of retail in fostering these vital communal spaces. In this episode, we're going to try to just really define some characteristics of the third space, and then hang on, because next episode, we're going to dig a bit deeper into how to create or support them as a community. Welcome back to Retail Radio. This is Ryder Richards. I'm here today with Elliott Cook. Elliott works with us at Retail Strategies. Elliott, do you mind introducing yourself and saying a few things?
Sure. Hi there, Ryder. My name is Elliott Cook, and I am the Director of Real Estate here at Retail Strategies.
Let's see. We're going to be tackling a topic that might last a couple of podcast episodes at this point. We're introducing this idea of the third place. And of course, it's maybe not new to y'all, and it's not new in the world in general, but it's coming up more and more frequently. And Elliott and I have been talking about it, doing some reading about it, and all those kind of things. So I think today what we're going to try to do is introduce the topic of a third place and maybe talk through why they're important, why it keeps surfacing right now, and some of that kind of good stuff. So Elliott's done more research on this than me. Elliott, can you briefly describe what you think a third place might be?
Yeah. And, kind of to set the scene, you mentioned that I think a lot of people are familiar with this concept and have become familiar with this concept, certainly during the pandemic, maybe in the years leading up to it as well over the last decade or so. But this is something that's really important to both of us, I think, in the way that both of us kind of live our lives, as well as the way that we kind of see the society around us. So an interesting topic to really dive into for both of us. But, simply put, the third place is a term and a concept that was created by Ray Oldenburg in the late 80s in a book that he published called The Great Good Place. And the idea is that everyone has, the most high functioning and the happiest people in society kind of have three places where they spend the majority of their time. The first being where they live, the place where they dwell and reside. The second being the place where they go to work, which interestingly enough, during the pandemic and really in our modern day society, oftentimes has become one, which is something we can certainly break down and talk about. And then finally, having that third place, which is kind of that public place where we gather, where we can relax, where we can socialize, and kind of feel that sense of connectivity to our community. What do you think, Ryder?
Yeah, I've been working remote for a while, and what I found was even working remote, I was trying to find other places to work and then finding other places to socialize. And so this becomes kind of something that we do for ourselves, but it's just kind of an interesting aspect of the way it plays out across society. The way that whenever you get rid of it, such as during COVID and the lockdowns, then all of a sudden this kind of resurgence for socialization swells up. So the third place starts coming up again. I think what's interesting is that the books were already out there, that people were already looking at how people were socializing, why work wasn't enough and why home wasn't enough. In work, of course, you have a special role you have to play. You sort of have to fit into a hierarchy or a system there, and you're doing what you do for survival, for money. Now, when you get home, maybe you have to be a brother, a dad, a parent of some sort, right? Maybe you're a caretaker when you get home. And so you're not really allowed to sort of be all of yourself there either, because there's certain responsibilities. So the third place offers some interesting ideas about like how you learn how to socialize, how you learn to be an individual, and what you do with your free time that allows you to really kind of, I think, maybe flex identity in an interesting way. Maybe that's not the right way to say it, but it's kind of a fun way to say it. I like the idea of flexing your identity.
You bring up a really interesting point, too, about how these concepts already existed. Certainly, we talked about Ray Oldenburg wrote this book in the late 80s, certainly kind of gained relevance in the early 90s. And then Robert Putnam also wrote a book in the mid 90s called Bowling Alone, which was about this concept that after World War II, all of our kind of, society as a large in America really bonded around these societal organizations or these places that they all gathered, whether that be the corner pub, certainly being a member of a religious affiliation, going to a church or a synagogue, and then things like bowling leagues or,
Yeah.
bridge clubs or whatever the case may be, these different societal organizations that have kind of fallen to the wayside in a lot of respects, in the decades following. As we think about that, both of those documents, both of those books were written before or at the early advent of the internet, of the World
Mhm.
Wide Web, and certainly the birth of social media, and how this idea that social media connected all of us, how we've been more connected than ever. But if you read about younger generations and just our society as a whole, we are very disconnected. We are very lonely. And even though we have connectivity at our fingertips, we've never felt more isolated than the people around us. So the third place is a way to address that. And something, Harvard has also done a study for like 50 years, no, longer than that, I believe going back to the 1930s about adult development. And they have concluded over that almost 100-year study that the key to happiness for an adult is good relationships. Those are personal relationships. That's certainly with your spouse or the person you love, your family, but also the community around you. And that the happiest people in the United States are the people who are most connected to the kind of community in which they live.
What I think is fascinating about that is some of us, we have work friends, we have family friends, but there's also this idea of having people that are outside of that that are not going to be putting pressure on you for certain kinds of responsibilities. Maybe they're putting a different pressure on you. Maybe when you go to the third place, the bar, the pub, the coffee house, you have to be a little more clever, a little more engaging, right? Maybe you can sort of try out different roles of who you are. And what's kind of interesting about that is that, we've talked about the internet and we've talked about, everyone knows about this idea of isolation, or what do they call it? Echo chambers that you can get stuck in.
Yeah.
And I think what makes that kind of interesting is that if the internet is giving us an echo chamber, and if you surround yourself with like-minded people for an echo chamber, then are you really having civic discourse? And I'm coming from an arts background. I can't help but think of like the salons where all these artists would hang out and argue with each other all day, and they ended up generating some of the best art.
Yeah.
And it was not only the arguments, but it was because they would get together and they could be friends afterwards, but they were pushing each other, they're challenging each other. So philosophy, art, all these kind of high level interactions that form culture and communities that end up going down in history seem to come from these like hangout places.
Yeah, when we think about the kind of the modern community, a lot of times we are separated by socioeconomic barriers. And, coffee houses, pubs, community centers, parks, a lot of these gathering spaces, like we talked about, houses of worship. These are places where people can rub shoulders and connect with each other that otherwise would not. And ultimately, like you kind of mentioned, that brings upon, really positive discourse, sometimes uncomfortable discourse. But I know you and I have both talked about this idea of friction, that friction, while it can be uncomfortable, really can be a positive thing. There's energy that's created from that. And those, different modes of thought, different ways to approach your neighbor who may not look like you or have a different background than you do, an understanding of them can really help build and foster that healthy community, and also, really bring about your own personal happiness as well.
Yeah, and we're talking about this abstractly, and in some regards, like psychologically, what this does for health, how we move through the world, and of course, the studies done on this are by sociologists who started out sort of what happened after the 1920s. Then all of a sudden, we had this massive rise in people who were participating in clubs and in groups and civic discourse, like you're talking about, like bowling alleys or rotaries or things like that. And these people were giving back to the community. And along the way, they would develop friendships that were long-term friendships.
Yeah.
So what's fascinating, and I think it's Putnam's book, is he talks about how we are in a place now where we are volunteering or participating, but it's through something like our checkbook.
Mhm.
We're not actually showing up and being present around other people. We're not volunteering in sort of physical, active ways the way we used to. So we're participating in a lot of things, but we're just not doing it in, I guess, this sort of like very mammalian way where we just show up as animals and we're around each other. And that sort of allows us to do things like play. I think when you're around other people, you actually sort of get to be a little more fun loving, and you sort of get to participate and you encounter challenges together and get to group solve. And those are all great bonding experiences that maybe go missing when you're limited to just something like the internet. And of course, we can get into some of this more later, but I think
Definitely.
there's some sort of key aspects to a third place that allow us to get together and work on things and become friends rather than like work.
Yeah.
You work on something there, but maybe you don't become friends with everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of talking about the history of this and why this matters. And I know um, we're talking about connectivity, we're talking about social media and phones and things like that too. And I know we're going to, probably delve deeper into that in future conversation. But, it is very American. And I know I keep referencing America, but this is a global thing, of course. But as we kind of focus on how this reflects itself or how this is implemented in the United States, historically, it is very American for us to be connected to the community around us. And, if you're familiar with Alexis de Tocqueville, back a very long time ago, he wrote that his early study of Americans and of democracy was this belonging and that this kind of shared effort that these newly formed Americans felt to the place where they had decided to reside. And I think there is a ripple effect for better or for worse. Obviously, that has waned, that's been stronger at different areas, at different times in our nation's history. But it really is what makes us American. And a lot of times, a lot of the communities where all of us decide to live today, they were founded and built around this very principle. So,
Yeah.
go ahead. Yeah.
Oh no, I was just going to chime in. Like, de Tocqueville's got a lot of interesting insights about Americans, like how they share their beliefs, how they share their values, how they form these groups. And I think one of the things that he was interested in was America as an experiment, democracy as an experiment, and the idea that somehow these groups that we're participating in were allowing us to think and enact problem solving amongst each other, and
Definitely.
that spread across the nation. He really saw this as kind of like a founding thing that could save democracy. And I'm, not to get too political on this, but I do think that that's an interesting aspect that as this has gone away, we've also noticed a decrease in, let's say, democratic conversations where people are willing to cross the aisle and
Yeah. I
engage
mean,
with each other.
you're exactly right. I mean, I think that's what everyone, no matter what side of the aisle you are on, we're looking for more of those situations where either our political figures or the people that we feel are politically opposed to us in whatever angle that may be, we wish that we could have more of those, literally the State of the Union address last night, this idea
Mm,
of sitting across a kitchen table and having these conversations. Where do we do that with people who are not our family or the people we work with, and that are have different opinions and come from different perspectives? Where are the places where we can have that kind of middle ground conversation? And the third place is the place, where that happens. So let's talk about the
yeah,
characteristics of the third place, Ryder. I think, for those
sure.
that are
Yeah. Like,
listening, how do we kind of define the third place?
yeah, let's see. Well, there's, of course, in the books I list some out, but it's just kind of what we're talking about is to go across the divide or the aisle or the line there and talk to people who are outside your normal group. There's something about public places that allows that, right? Where there's a group of people around and it sort of does something that they call neutralizing. So it can kind of neutralize how people interact with each other. And what this also does is it levels things out. So the CEO can come in and talk with the guy who's mowing the lawn, and you're meeting on different ground. It's not economically based hierarchy there. It's really maybe who's more clever, who's more cool when you're in the bar, or something like that. Or at the church, you're meeting for a different set of reasons. So one of them is they're kind of neutral, and that means that they can accept everybody. It's not exclusive, like you're not going to a club where they're setting up a line outside or anything like that. I think we always talk about exclusivity, but with that also comes economic sort of division, right? That you have to be of a certain economic class to
Yeah.
participate in certain things. And something else it talks about, which I find interesting, is conversation is a main thing to have at third places. It's one of the reasons why, even when I was younger, I'd love to go to listen to live music, but I knew that I wasn't going to get to know anybody while I was listening to live music, right? So if you want interesting conversation, you go to some place that maybe has background music, but is a little more chill.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you think of anything else?
You know, when I think about the characteristics of a third place, I immediately go back to those first few months of the pandemic and those places that were taken from us. And all of a sudden, when these things were taken away and we didn't have the ability to gather and just simply be around each other, whether that be at a restaurant, whether that be at a movie theater, right? Or like you mentioned, going to a concert at a live music venue, as well as just like parks and things like that. I remember there being a time where you couldn't even go to the main park in downtown Birmingham where I live, because of social distancing and kind of the early days of that. There was a desire for that once it was taken away. And those are the places that people really wanted to gather and all of a sudden appreciated where they maybe didn't before that. So thinking about those places, like you mentioned, those kind of neutral grounds, places where we could just kind of run into each other, whether that be the grocery store or a park, or like we mentioned, a church or something along those lines. They're very important to who we are. They're very important to that sense of community, that sense of belonging. And like you talked about, where conversation is the main activity. I think all of us, we have somewhere where we go throughout our, daily things that we do, where this is really important to us, whether we're fully aware of it or not.
Yeah, there's something that about that as well. If we're doing something daily, then it was one of the points they brought up in these books is that it's to become a regular.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they're talking about the people who are most likely to find a new third place and start frequenting it. And so couples might find them together, but single individuals might find them. There's also the idea that you can create something that is welcoming to a third place, right? You can set up, regular activities, but there's something about literally walking into the coffee shop and everyone knowing who you are. And you feel a little bit better about it. You feel a little bit more at home. So it's something about encountering the same people time after time. So going on that walk at the park every day at 3 p.m., going to the bookstore, participating in a book club, something like that, even going to the gym, something like that can all be ways to keep encountering the same people. And that actually grounds you within a community. That's the social fabric of a society, is to know your neighbor, quite literally, to know them physically and be able to say hi to them.
Yeah. You talked about this, and both of us are people who, in fact, we at one time have gone to the same coffee shop and are friends with the owner of that coffee shop and feel very connected to that place, and that ties us to our community, where people are different age groups and look different ways, and all different types of people. But becoming that regular, feeling that sense of community, that I've seen this via retail strategies in all of the places that we work across the United States. I've seen this in tiny communities, as well as large, very large metro areas, where those places where we can gather and connect with each other are the places where you have the most vibrant communities. So ultimately, as much as we are all looking to have that, that safety net, that place where we live, have that good job, and whatever the modern day workforce looks like, whether that's working remote, working at an office, or a hybrid approach, for us to ultimately feel most connected and have that sense of belonging that we all desire, whether we realize it or not, we at least need some component of this in our life.
What's kind of interesting about the third place as well is we've run some, at this point, long-term experiments through social media, through other sort of chat forums and things like that, to move these online. And we've tried it repeatedly. And there's even venues now that are, it's interesting to have physical venues like barcades where people go to play games physically around each other. So, there's this kind of movement towards the virtual with a lot of this, and there is the idea that there's online gaming where people are developing friendships. They are developing these kind of things. There's online platforms where people circle up around a certain topic and they can become friends. Um, I think it's something that's kind of worth getting into because there's sort of a lack of physical movement that allows an ease. So you can find people who are more in tune with very specific things that you have. They do tend to fulfill a lot of the requirements, but one of them they tend to miss out on is, of course, the physicality. However, there is something about maybe the term is ableism, right? Like there are certain people who don't have the ability to get to third places as easily. So we
Yeah.
do have these virtual spaces that are trying to pick up some of the slack for that. There's just certain traits that they just maybe will not have that we're going to have to sort of, I don't know, either figure out or extend.
Yeah. You mentioned the virtual spaces. At their, you know, at their core, they are not bad, and most of these were created to address connectivity and to bring people together. But ultimately, still having that physical space and actually having that in person communication and conversation is so important to who we are. And you can just see there are plenty of studies that have been done over the last decade plus of younger people as well as older people as well. But certainly as we look at Gen Z, for example, and I know we'll talk about this later, but talking about Gen Z, who is the first generation to grow up connected basically for the majority of their life or for the life that they can remember. There is an epidemic going on of isolation and depression and anxiety that this generation feels that generations previously did not feel because of that forced connectivity of being in person. This idea, there's an Atlantic article from a couple of weeks ago talking about how we just don't hang out anymore, and the fact that we don't spend time together, whatever the case that may be, has truly made us more anxious. It's made us more depressed, and it's made us feel less connected to all different types of things within our society. And there have been really negative consequences to our country that I think all of us can feel. We all can identify, and ultimately, that third place is a way to address that, and at least hopefully we can turn that corner and start to reappreciate those places again.
Yeah, I mean, and of course, this is that resurgence again, because when we start looking around and we're looking, I was thinking about this earlier, every problem that you can kind of see in society, there is an interesting idea that the third place can somehow help ameliorate or alter that problem, reverse the course of that problem. So if we're getting our social connections and all of a sudden we have more civic engagement and we have people who care about other people around them, then you start seeing these larger problems disappear. But so this was at its height, I guess, in the 60s, and then it just started plummeting. And we've just sort of witnessed this like just trend off. And one of the things that has kind of come up as well in several ways is that we might be losing the ability to actually have discourse with people that are outside of us, right? We've become so accustomed to only having certain types of conversations, and also, of course, online being able to just shut things off once they get to a difficult level. And the problem I think too with the anxiety that shows up is that we tend to lash out. One of the things when I used to teach elementary school was that if people do not feel safe, then they can't actually learn. There's this fear-based mechanism in your head that's it's a fight or flight thing that happens, and when you're not safe, you can't actually take in new information and sandbox it and hold on
It's
to it
really interesting.
and turn those into new insights.
Yeah.
So I think the one thing about a third place is that it has to actually feel safe, and that will allow us to actually be creative with our idea exchange.
Well, you mentioned that neutral ground. Like, where is that
Mm-hmm.
place that people of different backgrounds that approach life in different ways? Where can they meet in that neutral place. What this is certainly not purely political. I know we've mentioned some political opinions here, or the political component of this, but whatever, once again, your stance politically is, I think we can all agree that civic engagement is very low. People
Mhm.
are very unhappy with the current political status
Well,
in
when
this
I get on
country.
Twitter, there seems to be a ton of civic engagement.
Yeah, exactly, right?
Yeah.
But people are people are very unhappy with the political outlook of our nation currently, but yet civic engagement and actual voting is at
Mm.
very low numbers, and that's across all economic groups, all socioeconomic groups. So it's certainly important to think about that. And where is that place that we can feel connected? How do we reconnect ourselves to the place where we live instead of just having this kind of transactional environment with the world around us? The more that we feel connected to the place where we live, and for those of you who are listening who are elected officials or are city employees, where is that place in your community that people can come and gather and connect and feel that connection to your community? So important. Obviously, at Retail Strategies, we are thinking oftentimes of the real estate, and that could be downtown real estate. It could be national real estate areas as well. Where are those national retail corridors? Something like a Starbucks, something like a grocery store. I think all of us, a lot of times think about just rubbing shoulders with people and running into people at the grocery store. That also on your main street, whether that's a park, whether that's a public place, or whether that be, like we mentioned, a coffee shop, a brewery, something along those lines. Where are those activated places where all of us can gather and really, share the experience of what it is to live in your individualized community?
Speaking of things like the grocery store, one of the points I make in the books is that a third place is usually has like a little bit of a low profile.
Yeah.
It's not some place that's pompous or something like that. And so you could just have a market outside on a weekend and draw people in. And there's things like that. And so one of them is identifying the place. And then one of the other things is like making sure you have that open access and making sure it's neutral, but also probably having some events so that people have time to hang out and have an excuse to sort of bump into each other, things like that. And these can be sort of manufactured. And I always think of it like, once again, when I taught school, then there's a lot of icebreakers, and you know that they're cheesy, but dadgummit, they work, right? So I think about that sometimes as like I wish sometimes I want to be too cool for school, but I'll once I get involved in,
Once
I
you do
don't
the
know,
trust fall, you all of a sudden you're in.
in between your knees and waddle around, all of a sudden, everyone's friends.
That's funny. That's funny. Yeah. Once again, why does this matter? Why are we talking about third place? And certainly when we think of this as an organization with the communities that we're trying to work with, this is something we're trying to identify. And certainly development, strategic planning for your downtown, recruiting national retail, local retail, regional brands, things along those lines. That's economic development. But it is also incredibly important for the health of your community, not only for the sustainability of the community as a whole, but there's this concept that's now kind of developing that we're all aware of physical fitness. Where are we as a community with our social fitness? How much are we interacting with each other? How much are different groups within our communities coming and sharing thoughts and spending time together? And ultimately, the places that are going to be successful, the places that are going to thrive for the decades to come, are going to be the places that have these things. Some that cost $0, like a public park, something along those lines. Places where we can connect with people who have shared value systems or shared interests with us, but then also places where we can connect or at least rub shoulders with people who we disagree with, but find that common ground with. And those communities are the ones that I think are the most vibrant and healthy, and I think will continue to be that way in the years to come.
Part of that is supporting those, right? It's one of the interesting things that has happened over time is that once something is working very well, we seem to get distracted, start looking for something else.
Sure.
Yeah, yeah. So, some of it is maintaining those things. I've been working out lately at the YMCA, and I find that to be sort of one of these places that serves so
Great
many
third place.
functions.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Incredible third place.
Yeah. And so one of those is once you start thinking about the third place, it really is looking around and seeing if you can find them. So, I think the challenge is to, as you go throughout your day, consider what your third place is. Consider
Yeah.
maybe what somebody else's is. Maybe dip into their third place, see what's shaking.
A couple months ago, I spoke to a college class at a local university. There was about 60 students there, all obviously between the ages of 18 and 23. And the professor, I kind of talked about this. I kind of talked about this concept. And the professor made every student go around, introduce themselves, say where they were from. And they were from literally probably 30 different states. And then finally, they all had to say what their kind of favorite third place was. And, the college kids, it's interesting talking about that Gen Z group that has
Mhm.
grown up with social media, that has grown up with a cell phone for the majority of their life, hearing them go through that exercise. And they still are wanting those same things that we all want, right? And for a lot of them, it was, the social commons or the student union. For a lot of them, it was the coffee shop where they go. For some, it was like, going to a golf course or, playing soccer with other students or something along those lines. But this concept is really important. And when we think back to our younger years, this is a lot of times when we think, our happiest times were times where we were spending not meaningless, incredibly meaningful time. But at the time, we didn't realize that with our peers, with
Mhm.
people that we enjoyed spending time with. And ultimately, a lot of times that's why we feel so fulfilled, we feel connected and rooted to the place where we are. And certainly we're learning and taking in experiences from people who have different experiences and have different backgrounds than we did as well. So think about your times if you're older, think about times in your youth, or maybe you had that maybe when you were in school or in college, and then ultimately maybe at other stages of your life where you kind of had that experience. And how can you reconnect with that in the community where you live currently? We are all so busy. It's thought to be the busiest we've ever been. But in reality, a lot of times what we're doing with our free time is we're just isolating ourselves to our phone, right? For
Mhm.
those who have kids, for those who have multiple jobs, things like that. Yes, you are very, very busy, but what are you doing with your free time? And can you spend less of that free time isolating yourself to a phone or to a television screen, and more of that time just being with other people, and building, or reconnecting with that sense of community?
Yeah, I think yeah, that's a good challenge for all of us to just go out and consider and actually start physically participating.
Yeah.
And I think kind of on that note as well, maybe what we do is wrap up this episode and we start leaning into what we're going to do next episode, right? I think we're going to talk a little bit more about some migrations of third spaces, how they can be developed. Some of the I still think the virtual idea is interesting because I think that it's going to continue gaining traction, and then the ideas of what, do you push back on that or how do you incorporate it into what you do next? So but yeah, a lot of this is community building, and if that community is robust and strong, you'll have other things. You'll have kids coming back home. You'll all of a sudden have new dollars entering your community, which allows you to do more third space building and more placemaking. So, yeah, I think these are all good aspects that we should jump into next time. And until then, yeah, thank you so much for tuning into the podcast. And Elliott, thanks again for your insight and thanks for your time on this.
Hey, thank you, Ryder. Really enjoyed talking to you. Love picking your brain. You have so much wisdom as it comes to this topic, and really look forward to talking to you in upcoming episodes.
All right. Thanks a lot. And thank you all for listening. If you do get a chance, please give us a thumbs up on whatever platform you're listening on. Of course, subscribe to us so you can get the upcoming episodes as Elliott and I jump deeper and deeper into this topic. All right. Thanks a bunch.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for tuning into Retail Radio by Retail Strategies. We hope today's discussion on the third place has sparked new ideas and insights on enhancing community, solving some of our problems, maybe looking at retail spaces differently, which is, of course, what we do here at Retail Strategies. Now, in our next episode, we'll take a deeper dive into how you can create a third place in your community, trying to offer practical tips and strategies to foster these spaces where people can hopefully connect and thrive. Once again, thanks for joining us, and until next time, keep your ear to the ground and your eyes on the trends.